Hey guys, Dr. Stitzel here. So we're on to our next application of macroeconomic theory here in Principles of Economics. As we've been working through them, our topic today is federal deficits and debt. So I'm going to start with where we should generally start on these topics, which is defining our terms that we're going to use. So we've got a couple. These are relatively easy. The first is deficit. So deficit is just the amount by which annual government spending exceeds tax revenue. Okay, so when you're spending more than what you're taking in revenue, that is a deficit. The opposite is a surplus. That's the amount by which annual tax revenue exceeds government spending. So if you're taking in more revenue than you're spending, you're in a surplus. So our public debt is our total accumulation of past deficits and surplus. So if 2 years ago I had a $10 deficit, last year I had a $20 surplus, then my, I wouldn't have a debt in that case. I'd be a plus 10, right? So let's do the opposite example. If I had $50 in deficit and then the next year I had $25 in surplus, then my debt would be $25 because that would be the shortfall of my surplus over my deficits. These are held in government-issued notes. These come in different types. You can hear about treasury bills, treasury notes, and treasury bonds. Those are all different lengths of how long the maturity is on those. So how long from the time that you buy it until the U.S. government pays that back. And so that's the nature of those. We're not going to get into too many details of those particulars, but just know that if I'm talking about treasury bills, notes, or bonds, that we're talking about how the U.S. government issues its public debt. Okay, so before we really get into some of the nitty-gritty on the various parts of this, I want to talk about public choice theory. So public choice theory is the economic analysis of political and public decision-making. And the reason that that's important here is that determines how it is that we get our federal deficits and debt, also our state and local as well. But in this class we're focused on macroeconomics. We'll be a little more focused on the federal level of governance. Okay, so there's a few ideas here. The first is econ has a lot to say about how voting works. In fact, a public finance class. I also teach that class here at West Texas A&M. Will cover voting. Our main idea, our main economic model, I should say, is what we call the median voter theorem. And the median voter theorem is this idea that when you are dealing with a spectrum of options, and of course you can combine different things into representative platforms, and then that platform might be on a spectrum, right? So it is a simplification. It's a pretty accurate simplification, especially in a system where we've got a two-party model like we have in the United States at the federal level, really all the levels, because there isn't any practical difference between state and local. More on that in public finance if you're interested in that. But this forms our election incentives, right? So our election incentives are to figure out how to construct policy or choose a candidate, or how a candidate might situate themselves, right? And those election incentives will be formed by how it is that voting works. The simplest model, of course, is a winner-take-all model in which we want to appeal to as many voters as we can, and then if we win, we get the electoral seat, or the presidency, or we get our policy passed, or we don't. Okay. Now, this leads to a lot of influence from special interest, right? And this is what we call rent seeking. So rent seeking is a little bit of an odd term because the colloquial use of rent is like paying for our apartment every month, right? But rent in this case is an economic idea that means a benefit that's gained from non-competitive forces. So I want to get a rent. How do I get a rent? An economic rent would be something like I lobbied for something and then I got government spending, or I got a regulation that harmed my competitors and that allowed me to have higher profits. Those are economic rents. Okay, so let's talk median voter theorem. So median voter theorem is this idea that whoever it is that is closest to the median voter on a spectrum is going to win the election. Let's see why. Let's say we have an election. Let's say it's a presidential election. Okay, and so I'm going to color code these for you, but they're going to be in pairs of outcomes. So don't be thinking of this as political parties, although that is an application of this, right? Let's say candidate 1 over here is way to the left, and candidate 2 is pretty moderate. They're pretty close to the center. Okay, so who will vote for candidate 1? Well, about halfway between them is this point here. So everybody to the left of 1 is closest to 1. The basic idea of the median voter theorem is people will choose whichever candidate, whichever policy, whichever option, whatever it is they're voting on, whatever party is closest to where they are. Okay, so we're saying like this is the most extreme left and this is the most extreme right. That can be any number of policies, right? So if we're looking at like an individual topic, an individual thing that we'd be thinking about in an election, this could be I want as little spending, and this is I want as much spending as possible, right? So just how much government spending should happen. Left is none, and right is 100%. Give me, the government crowds out all other forms of spending, right? And then if I'm the left side of this, and I'm here somewhere, I'm really extreme, who am I voting for if my options are 1 or 2? Well, I'm closer to 1, right? So this halfway point between them becomes interesting because anybody that's here, they're close to the middle, they're going to vote for 1. But if this person here is close to the middle, but they're on this side, they're going to vote for 2. So why is this median voter here so important? The median voter is so important because whoever is closer to this will have more votes. How do we know that? Well, 2 is getting all of these people. It's getting everybody between them and the median voter, and it's getting all of these people. Whereas 1 is getting this group and this group. It's split right there. You can see that there will be many more votes for candidate 2 in this particular situation. Okay, so now, say there's a reshuffling, right? And we've got our next election. And so, candidate 1 is going to realize, or party 1 is going to realize we need to run a candidate that is closer to the center, right? So we might see movement this direction. So here's candidate 1. We'll make them the odd number, so we'll call that 3, right? And maybe there's quite a bit of success there, and so we're gonna see. Yes, that's right. We're gonna see the other party run the even party run candidate 4. So they might come back to the right a little bit. You can see, sort of made it kind of close, but you can see the distance here is that 4 is closer, still closer to the median, and we're going to see maybe that's the halfway point. So who wins? Well, we know everybody to the left of 3 and everybody to the right of 4 will obviously vote for those respective candidates because they're obviously closer. I'm over here, I want more spending, but 4 is less spending than I want, but it's way more spending than 3, right? And so all the people that I won before, if I was the odd numbered party, still going to get all those people. Plus, I'm going to get all the people between those two groups because now I've moved the halfway point between us. But I won't capture the median voter, which means this group of people right here is the decisive vote. This will be a very close election, right? Because, if this is 50-50, this is like 45, 48%, something like that. So there's going to be 48% of the vote this way and 52% of the vote this way, and the even numbered candidate is going to win. So over time, what should we expect? Now, this is where, good critics of the model should say, well, but shouldn't there be movement towards the center? I'd actually argue there is, but good critics should say, oh, well, we should see something like this. We should see movement towards the center. Okay, now who's capturing? Well, it's very difficult to say. It looks like maybe 6 is still a little closer. The halfway point between these two is like right here, but 6 is still capturing the median voter and therefore going to win this election. Okay, so the real insight of public choice theory is that politicians and bureaucrats make choices in their own best interest. Okay, so one of the things that we want to reject is the idea that there are like disinterested technocrats or benevolent dictators or something. This is not how people behave. People that are in public office, the most charitable thing we can say is they are at least not any different than us, at least not any better than us, right? And the reason that that's important is to say, what are you doing? Why are you going to school? Why are you working your job? Why are you, right? It is to better yourself and your situation. And yes, there are probably some, charitable people, or however you would say that, in public office. But as a general rule, people are self-interested, and they're going to make choices in the public sphere in order to better themselves. Politicians want re-election. Bureaucrats want bigger budgets and more power to their particular offices, right? There's a wide variety of implications because of this. So one of the greatest economists ever is James Buchanan, Nobel Prize winner, worked a lot. He's really the father of public choice theory, and he made that field and everything that I just covered on the previous slide. But also what's important about this is where that comes and collides with our topic today, which is deficits and debts, right? So he makes the following points. First, that deficit spending allows public programs to exist that otherwise would not exist, right? So that's the big takeaway. If we have deficit spending and we think in the context, right, we understand the world through the important lens of public choice theory, we will understand that deficit spending will allow public programs that wouldn't exist if we didn't allow deficit spending. And this is because taxpayers permit programs that they would otherwise oppose if they had to pay the full cost of it today, right? So if I can delay the payment, I'm more likely to purchase something. Taxpayers are the same way. Well, because they're the same people, obviously. This amounts to shifting the cost of government programs to future generations, right? The straightforward, obvious, you've heard every politician ever say this, right? But the problem with this is this has led to a steady expansion of the federal government, as you can always kick all the costs down the road, okay? All the costs down the road. So let's talk about those budgets. There's 3 ways that we conceptualize budgets, and that is annually balanced, cyclically balanced, and functional finance. An annual balanced budget means the federal government expenditures have to equal taxes every year. If they did this, this would be pro-cyclical, right? So it would move with the economic cycle. As the economy grew, we would have more to spend. We would spend more, right? So that's what I mean by pro-cyclical, going with the cycle. When the cycle goes up, the spending goes up. When the cycle goes down, the business cycle in this case, when the business cycle goes down, spending goes down. Annually balanced budget would give us a pro-cyclical government spending. The opposite is what we call cyclically balanced. So instead of balancing it every year, you balance it over the course of a business cycle. Over the course of a business cycle. So what that means is every time you go recession to expansion, so from peak to peak, right? So from peak to peak, then you would balance the budget, right? So when the economy is growing, when it's going up, like so, you raise taxes and you reduce spending. When the economy is contracting, you lower taxes and you raise spending. And you do this to the same amount such that surplus and deficits offset each other. This is intentionally and fundamentally countercyclical. Okay, so when the economy goes down in recession, government spending goes up. When the economy goes up in expansion, then government spending goes down. This should sound familiar. We covered automatic stabilizers in the previous lecture. The other way is functional finance, and this is what the government does now, and that is to ignore the budget and its impact on the business cycle, and instead focus on macroeconomic goals: economic growth, stable prices, full employment. This is roughly countercyclical because spending increases during downturns and spending increases during upturns. The problem with this, of course, everybody listening would immediately recognize the problem, right, is that the spending increases during the upturn. Spending increases during the downturn. I should say decreases. So the spending should go down when we are doing better. Spending decreases during the upturn, but does so more slowly. Even that's just kind of wishful thinking, right? The spending just increases more slowly during an upturn and increases rapidly during downturn. So we just always get increased spending. Okay. So let's look at the budget constraint. So how do you finance this budget constraint that we're talking about? How do we finance debt and deficit? Okay, let me set up the equation that we want to talk about. So remember, we're trying to finance the debt and the deficit. Money has to come from somewhere. Where does it come from? Well, on the left side of the equation is the federal deficit or surplus, right? So if government spending is bigger than taxation, we've got a deficit. If taxation is bigger than government spending, we have a surplus. Okay, so let's imagine, because it'll be easier in this case, to think of government spending being bigger than taxation, so we've got a deficit. How is it we can finance this? Where can the money come from? Well, there's three answers. The first is money supply. So this little delta sign is straight from your physics class, right? Delta is a change in. So we could have a change in the money supply. So, right, we have a deficit. The government could print more money, i.e. the government issues those treasury notes, bills, and bonds, and the Federal Reserve buys them with money that they have printed. They put that money into circulation. We could have a change in money supply to finance a deficit. We could also issue bonds. So treasury bills, notes, bonds, they could go out into the public. And now the public has volunteered more money there, and they could go and finance the deficit that way. Or the government has some assets. If they need to finance a deficit, they could sell them. So government land, government properties, different. The government owns things. It could sell those things off. Okay, so how does the money supply finance a deficit? The government sells bonds to the Federal Reserve. The Fed creates money, i.e. they print new dollar bills, or obviously a lot of times this is digital these days. This is what we call monetizing government debt. Okay, so the government creates debt, and you foot the bill through inflation because there's more money in the system. That money devalues the money that you currently have in your pocket and your bank account, or even your assets, and now the government has issued debt, and you're paying for it indirectly because they've watered down the amount of money that's in the system. Okay, so how do the bonds work? If the Fed doesn't buy the bonds, the public can. So corporations, banks, mutual funds, individuals, even foreign governments, we'll have some more on this later in the lecture, they can buy these things, they can buy these bonds and hold government debt as a form of their investing. And then, of course, mentioned government land. Other examples of government assets are telecommunications or offshore oil leases that the U.S. government might own. Any kind. Those are just examples, but any kind of assets that the government would own. Okay, so we talked about how do we finance debt and deficit. What are the implications of how we choose to finance the deficit? Okay, so we can do this with our good old injections and withdrawals equation. Remember this, right? So here are all of our injections, here are all of our withdrawals. We rearrange this. We see there's our government spending and there's our taxes. We can put them together and get our deficit, right? So I won't belabor the algebra here, but obviously everyone can see it, right? Subtract taxes to get it over here, right? Subtract investment and exports and get them over here. Now I can pair them up, right? Obviously, I could do this without the parentheses, but the econ theory says, look, the savings and the investment work together, or the imports and the exports work together, okay? So there are three implications of the way a deficit can be funded, right? So a deficit happens, there are bonds issued, those bonds end up purchased by the public. Where does that money come from? Well, one thing, if we assume savings is equal to investment, so let's take this thing out of the equation for a minute. So if there's a deficit and this is held constant, right? So we got a positive deficit, and let's say this doesn't change. Okay, so if savings doesn't change and investment doesn't change, those two things are equal. This would be a zero. This would drop out of the equation temporarily, right? In fact, let's just write this down so everyone can see it. So we're saying government spending greater than taxation. How do we account for this in a situation where we're only looking at m minus x? So we're saying, look, this is a positive number, right? This is greater than 0. How does this have to be greater than 0? Obviously, we have to have more imports than exports. That's called a trade deficit. Right? So we must be seeing that government spending goes somewhere, the spending that it's crowding out. What happens there? It must be that there are more imports than exports. Okay. The second thing that we could do is we could say, well, let's do the opposite. Let's say exports are holding exports, right? So I'm trying to walk you through these different options, trying to think through these. In reality, right, all these things are happening at the same time, but we want to do analysis. We have to hold things fixed, right? Just basic science. We have to control for certain things. We have to hold things fixed and think about the implications of what happens. If we knock this guy out, what do we have? Right? We would have government spending greater than taxation. That's a positive number, and we need to account for savings. What if we then held savings constant? So we say savings doesn't change. So if government spending is positive, if it goes up because we're subtracting the investment has to go down in order for these two things to be balanced, right? If savings is some fixed number and this goes up, this can't go up because then this equality would no longer hold true. Okay, this is crowd out. This is that idea that crowd out that we met before. Okay, so one way a deficit funding could happen is if those bonds, government spending happens, investment would have to fall in other areas because of the government spending. Okay, all right. Now let's do the same thing, and let's say government spending greater than taxation. And let's say, what are the implications if investment is held constant? Well, if this guy goes up, then this guy's got to go up. Savings has to rise. Okay, exports equal to imports, investment held constant. So we got three options: trade deficit, crowd out, increase in savings. How do we explain those things? Well, one, to finance a deficit, the government can either borrow, and they can borrow by selling bonds, or they can borrow by selling to the Fed, or sell assets. Okay. Two, rising deficits must be paid for by a combination of rising trade deficits, falling investments, and rising private savings. Okay. Now you're saying, wait, didn't we learn earlier that taxation is partially compensated from savings? Yes, but what we're saying is we're running a deficit. So not that we're increasing taxes, we're increasing government spending more than we are increasing taxes. So where might that savings come from? It might come from private entities buying government bonds, right? That would be an increase in savings. Okay, I digress. Let's turn our attention. We've sort of done deficits. Let's take a look now at public debt. Okay, public debt, a few terms that we want to define. The first is debt service. So debt service, very simply, is just the interest paid on debt. We have two different types of debt. The first is internally held, and that is public debt held by U.S. banks, U.S. corporations, U.S. mutual funds, U.S. pension plans, and U.S. individuals. Okay, so if somebody or an entity owned by the U.S. buys a debt, that is internally held debt. This is important because debt service paid on internally held debt is paid for by taxes on one U.S. group, taxpayers, and goes to another U.S. group, holders of public debt. This has really important implications. Okay, so national debt is a big deal, but this mitigates that concern a little bit, right? Because debt payments on internally held debt stay within the economy. You're moving, right? So the debt is $100 trillion or whatever. If half that's held, then payments on that 50 trillion in debt service, which is not 50 trillion because that's the debt, but whatever the service is, right? Just for round numbers, we'll say $5 trillion in payments, right? Goes to U.S. individuals. That is staying within the economy. You took it from taxpayers and you redirected it to people who hold U.S. debt. So it stays within the economy. So whatever concerns you have about the public debt, which are legitimate, and we're going to talk about that a bunch here in a moment, remember that whatever proportion, which is generally around half, is staying within the U.S. economy. Okay. The other side of that coin is externally held debt. Okay. Externally held debt is public debt held by entities foreign to the U.S., and that's about 50% of the debt. Okay, so now there are trade-offs. Econ teaches us about trade-offs. One of the trade-offs of paying down the debt, which a lot of people are clamoring for, is that paying down the debt would be regressive. And the reason for that is the tax base is on average likely to be lower income than the people who hold the U.S. debt. So who's the average taxpayer? Compared that to the average person who owns U.S. government treasury notes, bills, or bonds, it's likely that the people that hold the notes, bills, or bonds are going to be wealthier. So if you burden taxpayers in order to pay down the debt, you'll be transferring wealth from taxpayers, who are disproportionately less well off than the people who hold the debt. Okay, so something to think about. Not saying we shouldn't pay down the debt, but it's a consideration. There are trade-offs in everything, right? There are no solutions, only trade-offs. A core lesson of economics. Okay, so let's take a look at the data so you can visualize where the different things that I'm talking about are today, and we can look at some of the policies and some of the situations that we'd be considering. Here's a graph of the federal surplus or deficit. A couple of things jump out to us, right? So look, we're all the way back into the 1800s back here. There's this huge time period where what's happening? There's essentially no deficit or debt. What's this? Right, obviously that is the war. That's World War II, right? And so we're seeing there is some deficit taken there. If you look real close, you can see there's a surplus that came after the recovery from the war, right? And remember, this is deficit, so this is your year over year. This is not your debt. This is our deficit, right? And you get into the 1970s. That's when we actually see the deficit. Of course, here is the what is this? Late 90s, 2000s surplus. That's the biggest surplus ever. And so that is sort of the time period transition from the Clinton administration into the Bush administration that we see that. And then, of course, we have .com recession. I'm sorry, this is the .com. So the gray lines are recessions. I should have made that clear to start with. .com recession, 2008 recession, 2020 recession. And you can see the U.S. government basically, I mean, what are we looking at? Year over year, you're looking at in millions of dollars, right? So this is not 400,000, that's 400 billion. Is that right? Do I have that number right? Anyways, you can see the scale is just insane, right? Yeah, in millions of dollars. So this is millions, hundreds of millions, billions. So there's $400 billion. So these, what look like small, remember those are hundreds of billions of dollars right here, right? And there's a big change in reaction to the 2008. We're actually, notice that these are still deficits, but we're reducing the amount of the deficit year over year in the early and mid 2000s. Right, the aughts, if you will. And then all of a sudden, here's the 2008 recession, and we run this huge deficit, okay? So you remember the Bush administration switched to the Obama administration around this time. Both administrations went and ran stimulus payouts. Don't quote me on that. That's one of the first, and definitely the first of any magnitude, stimulus check payout, right? And we have this gigantic deficit. and then we reduce the deficit. This is not a surplus, right? Remember, it's not the slope. Surplus has to be up here. These are all deficits, but we're reducing the amount of the yearly deficit back down towards sort of historical numbers by the time we get to here. Notice that the turn towards massive deficit spending, it's not the 2020 recession, right? This is like 2015. So here's this, and then of course 2020 happens and just this absolutely catastrophic, and now we're running trillions of dollars of deficit as we go. Okay, so what I've done here is just kind of zoomed in for you. I picked up, what did I do, 1990. So I just basically zoomed in right here so you could kind of see those numbers a little closer. It's exactly the same. It's just kind of zoomed in. But you know, your immediate reaction to this should be what happened from here to here. 100 years of economic history is essentially no deficit, moderate deficit, and we are in a different time period now in roughly your lifetime since the year 2000 or so of we dropped into deficits right here, and the deficits have just exploded. So we are in a totally new era in terms of deficits, what governments do in terms of their budgets. And you know, when you're contextualizing what you're seeing on the news, what you're talking about, you know, Thanksgiving right around the corner, when you're getting to that situation, what should you be thinking about when those political conversations are cropping up? You know, keep this in the back of your mind. Like, and this is bipartisan, right? This is bipartisan because we've got Republicans here, we've got Democrats here, we've got Republicans here, we've got Democrats here. Like, it is what government spending is. What's one of the implications of median voter theorem? And, you know, people would say, oh, we're more polarized than ever. I think there's legitimate truth to that. And yet both right and left are moving towards more deficits. I mean, that's what we see here, right? Okay, I digress. How about the debt? Well, the debt, remember, is the accumulation of past deficits and surpluses, given that we really only have one little peak of significant surplus here. What year is this? This is like, you know, late 90s into 2000. So that's here. Somehow that barely makes a dent in the debt. I mean, it kind of does, right? It flattens out a little bit right there. The general trend of the debt since the 1960s is not just growth, right? Because, you know, linear growth or whatever, but to actually grow and then increase the rate at which it grows, right? So exponential growth is what we're looking at here, and you kind of see the big takeoff happening somewhere here. This sort of linear trend in the 80s and 90s, sort of flatten out here. Reaction to our .com is this. Reaction to the 2008 crisis is this. Reaction to the 2020 crisis is very interesting. Notice that this actually starts right before the technical recession. That's probably in part because of the pandemic, right? Whereas you can kind of see the inflection point right here. We were doing this, now we're doing this, happens as a reaction to the recession, right? So we're a quarter into the recession, we see that growth, okay? So debt's definitely growing very, very quickly. Later year growth looks pretty explosive. So it'll be interesting to see how that trends over time. Remember, this is millions of dollars, so millions, right? So quite an extraordinary number. That's 24 trillion or 30 trillion, wherever we're at now. Okay. One of the ways, though, that we want to evaluate debt, say our debt grew, right? So, you know, let's analogize this. We always got to be careful analogizing the economy to an individual or to a household. That's one of the things that hopefully you take away from this class is a household and its budget and whatnot are not a good analogy, not a good way to think about government spending, right? But let's just, as a very limited point, let's think about this. If you had $100 in debt and you made $200 a year, that might be a lot. If your debt doubled to $200, but your income doubled, you said 200. Let's say instead of 400, it went to 1,000. So you had a five-fold increase in income and a doubling of your debt. Did your financial situation get better or worse? Well, it clearly got better. That's why one of the ways that we want to think about things with the debt is the debt to GDP ratio. Okay, so if the debt did this, but the GDP blew it away, the debt might be actually a smaller portion of our economy. Okay, that's not actually what's happened. Let's take a look at the historical trend. The debt to, and there aren't really good markers, right? This nice round number of 100 is kind of interesting. In fact, let's just plot that on here. This nice round number of 100 is kind of interesting, but it's not inherently meaningful, right? And so we crossed that point, sort of flirted with it, running up to 2015, and then we passed it, and now we've blown it away. There's nothing necessarily fundamental about that, but remember, this is GDP. This is the productivity of the whole economy, right? So it's not government spending. It's GDP, the whole productivity of the economy. So, I mean, these are enormous, enormous numbers, right? The U.S. GDP is just an absolutely huge numbers. But let's look at this. So 60s, 70s, 80s, we are pretty stable, below 40%, around a third of GDP. Debt is around a third of GDP. We see this high growth period in the 80s into the 90s. This sort of tapers off, run down. That probably correlates very, very well with our surplus there, right? Debt relative to the GDP. Why would that be true? As there's economic growth, the surplus goes up. So even if we don't pay down the debt, we're seeing an increase in GDP, right? Because remember, we looked over here and we said, well, why didn't the debt drop very much? It's because you can run a surplus, increase government spending, and not really, you run the surplus, not necessarily pay that straight down to the debt. But it is going to be reflected because the GDP will have gone up, right? So debt could have stayed the exact same number the whole time. It didn't. We know what it looks like. But it, in theory, could have stayed the same the whole time, and all these fluctuations would just have to do with what the GDP did, right? So remember, we got two numbers moving here. So you could have this growth in debt, but if GDP grew even faster, debt would fall. And that's what we see here, right? But then as we can go back, right, look at our recession. Why this climb from 60%, we kind of saw, right, this climb from 40% to 60%, now this climb from 60% to 100%. What happened there? Well, those are the years just before 2000 to 2015. So if we look at that number, just before 2000 to 2015, that's that really sharp, consistent growth in the debt. It looks like GDP did not really keep up with that. GDP did not really keep up with that. How do we know? Because the debt as a proportion of the GDP went up. So 2015 to around 2020, just before 2020, we see a lot of growth in the debt. But it's relatively flat in the debt to GDP percentage, so we know the GDP went up here. And then, of course, this last spike of the debt is translated directly into all-time high in debt to GDP, around 130%. These seem like unsustainable numbers, but it's hard to objectively know what that means. It just gives us a sense of what the trends are like. Okay, and then again, here's just a zoomed in 2005 to current day. What does the debt percent of GDP look like? You can see that's that time period I was talking about, sort of from 60% to 130. That's that guy there. Okay, so what's the Federal Reserve doing during this time period? There's new, and we're going to talk about monetary policy. So basically, think of this as sort of a primer for what we're looking at, right? The Federal Reserve has engaged in new types of behavior. Okay, so the Federal Reserve asset balance sheet was around $700 billion for most of its history, up till the 2008 recession. And the 2008 recession is something that's going to be harped on in this class and any econ class that you take that's going to have anything to do with money, banking, macro, etc. And the reason is it was a watershed moment in the way that the U.S. in particular, but really most of the Western world, responded because of what we call the zero lower bound, the ZLB. Zero lower bound is this idea that we were able to use interest rates to combat recessions by increasing the money supply, but interest rates went all the way down to zero, and then it becomes a question of how effective really is further manipulation of the interest rate going to be as we get to and potentially go below zero. So the Federal Reserve added new tactics. Among these new tactics is what we call quantitative easing. Quantitative easing, which is a fancy word for directly buying things. So this is why I'm looking at the asset balance sheet. The Fed bought assets. How many assets did it own before? 700 billion, basically its entire lifespan. Okay. Now, in reaction to 2008, we get our first episode of quantitative easing. It takes us up to 2 trillion. Okay, so more than doubling, almost tripling. In fact, actually, I think it did triple, because if you look, there's 2 trillion. Tripling of the Fed balance sheet. So we had quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, 4, right? 2011, we have quantitative easing 2, right? So the Fed just kind of roughly kept the same amount. Then it intentionally runs quantitative easing. Then it intentionally runs quantitative easing, and so on. Now, you might look at this and say, wait a minute, quantitative easing 3, the numbers are kind of flat. Why is that? Because remember, bonds and treasury bills and whatnot have maturity notes. So they should roll off. They should mature and fall off the Fed's asset balance sheet, because the Fed should then get that money. And depending on what the Fed wants to do with the money supply, the money base, they should then make decisions. Well, notice that the reaction to the 2020 recession was a huge spike, right? So you might have heard, if you were sort of plugged in to what the Federal Reserve was doing at the time, right? You would hear lots of talk about all this quantitative easing, and economists are saying, "Wow, look what we did. We bought all this stuff, and then here's this trend, right?" So look, it's important, right? $2 trillion. We got to $3 trillion. Now we're at $4.5 trillion, right? And so economists are saying this is really something. We're at 700 billion. Now we're playing with 2, 3, and 4 trillion dollars in total assets on the balance sheet. We're just playing in a totally different ballpark. Now you would have to be listening, right? You'd have to be looking, reading, kind of staying on top of what's happening to the Fed balance sheet to have heard about this at all. And yet you'll notice this is a dwarfing of everything that has come before, to where in the immediate fallout, the Fed got up to 7 trillion in assets, right? So remember, millions of US dollars, millions, so millions, trillions, right? And then we've seen a steady increase, and the Fed is just in the recent quarters, starting to allow this to kind of dip back just a little bit. And I mean just a little, because notice this number is about 8.5 trillion. It actually got up to 9 and has kind of come back to about 8.75 trillion dollars in assets on the balance sheet. This number is just kind of zoomed in so you can see. I'm sorry. This is actually central bank assets to GDP. So I just took this number, total assets, and then made it as a ratio of GDP. This isn't even the peak, right? I think they stopped keeping this number, which is why I only have it to about 2017. But notice what's happening here. The valuation of the assets as a proportion of GDP is almost 0.25%. So this is nationalizing the Federal Reserve. This is something that needs to be talked about more, needs to be thought about, and economists and voters, people that are savvy with economics, need to be thinking about, is the banking system being run proportionately, like the sheer volume of assets being something that the Federal Reserve has, something that we want.